Hello, and welcome to today's QDU Academy session. Today, we're going to be looking at the first long prep topic for the Year 7 competition for 2024. That topic is that we should ban the Commonwealth Games. As always with these sessions, particularly when they're the first session of the year, we're going to look over a few things. We're going to start with the context behind the debate. Then we're going to move into setup, which is everything that happens in the debate before you get to your points. So it's your definitions, your models, any sort of, world building that you want to do before you even get into your points. Then we're going to go into some tips for trying to brainstorm points, and then a couple of tips in regards to structuring points and some tips for this particular debate. So let's start with the context behind the debate. The reason why we want to start with the context behind the debate is that the best way to try and work out how to win a debate or to come up with arguments in a debate is to ask yourself the question, why is this debate taking place? In general, an affirmative team in a debate is trying to solve a problem. So that means that they are going to try and find out what is currently wrong with the world that this in particular is going to fix. And so that's where you want to start your research. Why is it that this debate is taking place? What problem is it trying to solve? This is good for the affirmative team because it means that it's really easy to come up with arguments that have a good direction, which is to say that they feel as if they reach an outcome that is important in the context of the debate because the solution, which is the topic, directly solves the problem. As negative, you also want to start there because it means that you can start to think about, do you agree that this problem exists? Or do you think that actually this just creates different problems than the ones that currently exist? So here are a few guiding questions that might help you with your research before the debate starts. The very first one is just to look up, what are the Commonwealth Games? What is the history of the Commonwealth Games? Why were they created in the first place? Have they changed over time? You probably know that the Commonwealth Games are a sporting event, but the history behind them is probably quite important and you might not know as much of it. Look up if there are specific parts of the Commonwealth Games that are very different from other major sporting events, like the Olympics. So, are there some sports that are only played at one? Are there some countries that only compete in one? Does this mean that there are specific benefits of the Commonwealth Games that other major sporting competitions can't provide? Or is the Commonwealth Games actually something that is not particularly important? As well as the Olympics, there are other sort of lesser known but still big sporting events that lots of people participate in. And they're usually specific for their given sport. So things such as like the football or the soccer World Cup is obviously a very, very popular and well-known sporting competition for major team sports. But there are also like big athletic competitions, and I cannot remember the names of them, but for things such as your track and field events, there are World Track and Field Championships. Look them up. Do the people tend to consider them more or less important than the Commonwealth Games? If you are a swimmer, for example, what are the events that you think are the biggest events on your calendar? Just sort of have an idea of what are the significant big sporting events that exist, and how is the Commonwealth Games unique in between those? And one final thing to look at, once you have a good idea about what the Commonwealth Games are, who competes in them, what they compete in them, and any sort of differences from other big events, look up just, have the Commonwealth Games been in the news recently? This is a really good step to take with almost any long prep debate, because it's likely that people set topics about topical issues. And so there might be recent things that have happened about the Commonwealth Games that help you work out what the problem that the debate might be trying to solve is. And as a bit of a hint, the big one in this is Melbourne, which is Victoria, or more specifically regional Victoria. So maybe Melbourne is a bit of a red herring, but Victoria was going to host the next Commonwealth Games, which will take place in 2026 in a variety of places throughout regional Victoria. And then the Premier of Victoria, who was Daniel Andrews, it's now changed, but he was the one that made that decision, decided that the budget was getting unmanageable and it was not worth the financial investment. Now, It's useful to understand the context behind this. The big thing that we will get to in terms of tips for the debate is try not to overuse this example as a catch-all for all of your arguments. Think about the reasons why everything happened that has happened with the Commonwealth Games. Why is it that there were big budget blowouts? Because if you can understand why that happened, it means that you might be able to prove that it would also happen in future occasions. Or, if you're negative, that this was sort of a one-off, and that on other occasions it would be far more financially sustainable. So work out what have recent problems been, but also why have they happened, so you know if they're likely to be repeated. Cool. So now you've gone through the stage of understanding a bit of context behind the debate. Remember, you haven't even written any arguments yet, but hopefully you now feel as if when you start to write arguments, you know a lot and you can talk about a lot. So I would suggest the next thing to do is to go through all of these stages of setup, the very formulaic steps of let's find a definition, let's find a model, and you can apply some of the things you've already found out. So with defining the topic, you want to look at what some keywords are. There are a few keywords that I'm going to go over in this session because they pop up in lots and lots of debates, but this is your first debate possibly. But then you might not see them when we do other QDU Academy sessions on long preps in the future. That's just because these words have very standard meanings, but I want to cover them just for this occasion. The first is the word should. Now, the word should, whenever you see it in a debate, is important because it means that the affirmative team is going to change the world. It's saying that we should do something. And it also means that the affirmative team can sort of give some illustration of how they want to do that thing using their model. But the word should broadly means that we have a moral and a practical obligation to do something. Now, should always means that. So you don't necessarily need to define it in your topic, in your definition, but it's still useful to know that that's what it means. It means that you want to look for reasons why maybe the Commonwealth Games is morally wrong, or that the Commonwealth Games is practically bad. Possibly even both would be even best, but that's just sort of what the word should means. Next is the word ban. Now, ban feels really obvious, but I just want to cover it just in case there is any confusion about it. Whenever you see the word ban in a topic, it means that the affirmative team needs to get rid of it. In some types of ban debates, it's also important that affirmative says how they are going to ban it, or what the punishment would be if someone was to continue doing it illegally. This is not that kind of ban debate. If you compare to a debate that's like that we should ban smoking. In that kind of debate, it makes sense that maybe some people would continue to smoke cigarettes just illegally, and you'd want to explain what the punishment would be. It feels very difficult for people to have like an illegal Commonwealth Games once you've banned it. So that part of a ban debate is less relevant in this particular one. But it does mean that affirmative needs to make sure that they do completely get rid of the Commonwealth Games. They can't choose to sort of change it a bit. The negative team, interestingly, and we'll get to this on the next slide, can do that instead of banning it, but it means that the affirmative team has to get rid of it. And then the final thing is just, what are the Commonwealth Games? Again, everyone in the debate will probably have a good idea about what they are. They're not a very controversial concept in terms of purely definition compared to some debates where it can be. I guess if we go back to that we should ban smoking, you might have some confusion about whether vaping or e-cigarettes count as smoking in the same way that like not physical, but like normal cigarettes that people think of when they think of smoking are smoking. You might have teams that disagree about what counts as smoking. Both teams will agree what the Commonwealth Games are, but it's still important to define it just for the adjudicator's sake, just in case someone in the room doesn't know what they are. So then once you've gone through the stage of having your definition, you now then get into your model. This is how the affirmative team is going to do the part of the topic, which is banning the Commonwealth Games. The one question the affirmative team really needs to ask is, how will you ban the Commonwealth Games? Will you create anything to replace it? So if, for example, you find out that the Commonwealth Games is a really, really major thing on the sporting calendar, you may want to suggest that there are some sorts of things that might fill the space that the Commonwealth Games will leave behind. But as we discussed on the previous slide, there isn't as much to do in terms of how are you going to ban it or how are you going to police your ban, as there can be with other types of ban debates. It feels quite easy to believe that people would just like not have the Commonwealth Games if you banned it. Likewise, for the negative team, there are a couple of interesting things that you can look at. You are not allowed to get rid of the Commonwealth Games on negative, but you could, if you wanted to, change it in some ways but not get rid of it. Again, I think this is less useful than it is in other types of ban debates, because in some types of ban debates, there is a big problem with an unregulated industry that supplies something. So the negative team in a topic about banning smoking may want to make it harder to buy cigarettes without banning them, because they think that if they're banned, people will buy them in illegal ways and they'll be more dangerous. Again, people won't run illegal Commonwealth Games. Maybe you could try and argue it, but it feels like a bit of a long shot to try and prove it. So I'm unsure how much benefit you get from trying to say, oh, here's all the ways we should change the Commonwealth Games. But if you think that there are things that you can solve just by changing it without banning it, feel free to put those as a countermodel. But I would probably suggest in this particular debate to just go with the status quo. So now, once you've got your setup, you understand some context behind the debate, and you have your, not your points, but you have your definition, your model, then now you get to work on creating your points. Now, in this part of the QDU Academy sessions, if you access them through the Zoom link, we would sort of go through this as a collaborative exercise and we'd share our ideas at the end. Because this is just a YouTube video, you're not able to do that with me. But what you can do is I recommend pausing the video when I flip onto the next slide so that you can then spend a few minutes doing some brainstorming by yourself. If you're watching this with your team, that means then you can share your ideas at the end of that. But if you're just watching it by yourself, you can just keep note of what your brainstorm ideas were and you can bring them to your team's next meeting. So in terms of brainstorming point ideas, there are a few things that I think are important to think about. I think the big one is to try and think about how as many different groups of people are affected as possible by the affirmative team's policy, because this will help you come up with a whole bunch of arguments that affect people in really different ways, and it reduces the chance that you have lots of arguments that feel very similar. So, for example, in this particular debate, you might think, the Commonwealth Games are something that affects the people that participate in the Commonwealth Games. So all of the athletes are probably affected by the Commonwealth Games being banned. Affirmative might say that the Commonwealth Games is bad for athletes. They might say that if we got rid of it, something else would sort of take its place and it would be better. The negative team might say that the Commonwealth Games is really good for athletes, but athletes are probably a really big stakeholder in this debate. A second one might be the administrators of the Commonwealth Games. Are there people that are employed by the Commonwealth Games that aren't athletes, people that run the Commonwealth Games? Similarly, what about the places that host the Commonwealth Games? Are they benefited a lot by the tourism? Do people go to places to visit the Commonwealth Games? Did that happen when the Commonwealth Games were on the Gold Coast not too long ago? Or is it actually the case that the Commonwealth Games are financially not very sensible, because even though they bring tourism, it's not enough to make up for the very expensive cost of running the Commonwealth Games? What about all of the fans? Do people like to watch the Commonwealth Games if the Commonwealth Games isn't in their country? When it was in, I think it was in England in 2022, did lots of people from Australia watch it? Or did they actually not watch it and they would have rather watched something else instead? I don't know what the answers to these questions are, but that's why it's important to think about them so that you can, because I think the reason I don't know what the answers to those questions are is that there's probably truth on both sides. So you want to think about all of these stakeholders from both sides of the debate. One extra thing that you can think about is think about what the symbolism of the Commonwealth Games is, because we already have the Olympics that possibly provides a lot of the benefits or a lot of the harms of the Commonwealth Games. Why specifically is the Commonwealth Games a good or a bad thing compared to other events? That's a big thing to think about from both sides. If it's really important because there are certain countries that win gold medals at the Commonwealth Games that don't at the Olympics, maybe that's really good for the negative team. But maybe it's actually really bad if the Commonwealth Games is sort of acting as a reminder or a symbol of like negative harms of colonialism that existed in the past, if the only countries involved are countries that were colonized by a certain other country, for example. These are sort of questions about the symbolism of the Commonwealth Games that might be useful to think about. Now, obviously, I've given you the starting point to a lot of different ideas here. I think it's probably good to brainstorm, to think, can you use any of my thoughts as starting points for bigger thoughts of your own? Can you think of things that I didn't even mention whatsoever? Are there other people that are affected? That's the next thing that you should look on. And I recommend that now is a good point, as I move on to the next slide in a couple of seconds, to pause the video and to do some brainstorming for yourself. The final thing to look at is in terms of structuring your argument. I think that you should try and use a structure in a debate about banning things that draws a really clear picture of the process from banning to the solution. So if you're the affirmative team, it's really important that you explain what the big problem is at the start of your point that each of your points is going to solve. And then you can explain how banning it is able to make all of those problems better so that you can reach a good outcome at the end. Make sure that you don't, for example, just talk about all of the bad parts of the Commonwealth Games without referring to what the benefits of banning are, or if there's an alternative thing that is going to be better, or anything like that. Likewise, on the negative team, you can talk a lot about how the Commonwealth Games is good, but also make sure that if the affirmative team has some kind of alternative event that they think should take place, that you react to it and you explain why the Commonwealth Games is even better. And then the final thing to think about is this is a debate where some things are probably really obvious in terms of the outcomes, but it's important to explain to an adjudicator why they're really important. So for example, things such as like the economic cost of the Commonwealth Games is a really easy thing for everyone to think about. But things such as like sporting success for small countries that might not win many gold medals feels a bit harder to make a big deal out of because it's sort of one person does quite well at sport. Make sure that you tell the adjudicator why it's so important that any of your outcomes happen. Why is it so important that the symbolism of the Commonwealth Games is particularly good or bad? I think that's the one thing that you can also add to the end of your points in debates that are about sport that can help you explain why things are really significant and the adjudicator should care. And lastly, just in terms of responding to arguments, a lot of this in terms of rebuttal is just the same, but the opposite. Think about, has the opposition team proven that they are able to solve the problem that they talk about? Or think about, is the problem they talk about actually that big of a problem? It might be that there are lots of things that are true about the Commonwealth Games that both teams talk about. Make sure that you prove that whatever you think is true is the more significant claim. Why should an adjudicator care more about the economic cost of the Commonwealth Games than they should care about the sporting opportunities, or possibly the other way around, depending on which team you are on? So make sure that you think about, why are our points better than the other teams? Don't just sort of rely on having points that are true. Make sure that you prove why they're more significant. Cool. So now, thank you very much for watching to the end of this video. Obviously, if you're watching it, you have already found the QDU YouTube channel, but I'd still recommend keep on looking back at this because there are lots of good resources about other types of specific debating concepts, things about, for example, how to do different types of debates when you get later on in the year if you have topics that look a bit different to this one. If you have different sort of concepts that you want to learn more about. It gets also quite useful when you move past year 7 and into year 8 debating, when you have different types of arguments that you might want to think quite deliberately about. It can be useful to think about. But finally, thank you very, very much for watching to the end of this video, and best of luck in your next debate.